George Eliot was heavily influenced by Romanticism, and Middlemarch, in particular, is set in the Romantic period. And the title, I think, is expresses a basic romantic principle. The idea of sort of it's about the journey, not the destination. It's about marching through the middle, the means of life. Life is about the process um, rather than the ultimate meaning or explanation. Um, and That's a problematic basic to the plot. Um, um, the uh, protagonist Dorothea, the book starts out with a huge life mistake that she makes, and so that she has to kind of learn from the process of living, pick up the pieces, um, find herself in the wake of a misstep. The journey rather than the destination is about is that we kind of learn from the experience where we're going, and so that inevitably is about paying attention to unintended consequences. Which is another word for disappointments, frustrations. Um, on the other hand, there are some the key, very Frankenstein-like figures, which is to say, men with ambitions of kind of decoding the universe. Dr. Lydgate has the ambition of, like Dr. Frankenstein, of discovering the kind of primal tissue of all life, decoding the biological world in some way, um, achieving that kind of technical or scientific mastery over life. Um, and Casaubon likewise is at work on what he unsubtly titles his project "The Key to All Mythologies." He would decode literature, explain what all uh, myth and story is, what the point of it is. So apparently we wouldn't need it anymore. So another way of stating this principle of Middlemarch um, is that there's no such thing as mistakes, that life, the world, is nothing but sort of contingent accidents. And so living is, basically a process of salvaging what the world gives you. So here's a really nice example of sort of romantic disruption. That's a common feature of Wordsworth's poetry. Um, Ironizing or disrupting the perspective articulated by a narrator to introduce a surprising element that was beyond the narrator's conception at the beginning of the poem. So this begins as a poem sort of celebrating, the narrator is looking at this man walking down the road and sort of celebrating his seamless integration into the natural environment around him. He's kind of overdoing it in a way, like his formulations become kind of self-canceling by the end. It's a very beautiful beginning, I think. The little hedgerow birds that peck along the road regard him not. See how that sentence kind of draws us from the environment to the man, and so thereby sort of weaving him in, as it making him a part of the environment, a consequence of the environment, rather than a subject just moving through the environment. But then by the end, it's just before this moment of disruption, seems something kind of self canceling. He's by nature led to peace so perfect that the young behold with envy what the old man hardly feels. It's like, or he has patience is now, he's so patient that he, patience is a thing of which he hath no need. It's like he's so romanticized this man that he's kind of turned into a non-entity. Um, uh, and so the narrator gets a kind of comeuppance, a curveball out of the blue that totally rocks his world. I asked him whither he was bound and what the object of his journey. He replied, "Sir, I'm going many miles to take a last leave of my son, a mariner, who from a sea fight has been brought to Falmouth and there is dying in a hospital." So a typical Wordsworth maneuver. To introduce a certain mood um, and disrupt it in a way that leaves us speechless. Um, so, um, but that's clarifying of a kind of in this case a historical disruption. So what's getting undermined here is the romanticization of nature, this idea of harmony between man and nature. It is disrupted by history, by politics, by war, comes out of nowhere and turns the world upside down, or it's like a bomb coming out of the sky. The acknowledgement of history. Um, so that's a good poem, I think, for introducing Romanticism in general, because Romanticism is a consequence of historical accident and tragedy. Long story short, the French Revolution went overboard in its pursuit of rationalism as a kind of impossible ideal. So the Romantic period philosopher Hegel writes very powerfully about how the French revolutionaries' attempt to rationalize society needed to end in terror because their ideal was so strict. So their conception of rationality, rational society, was so strict that it couldn't properly manifest in the world. The world is inherently messy, so the only way for this ideal, this strict ideal of entirely rational government to be manifest in the world is through terror, is by killing people. Isn't that crazy? Right? Like that the most rational thing is like indiscriminate terror. Um, but it makes sense on a practical level. So, but part of what philosophers like Hegel are pointing out is that even in our rationality, there's um, often perversities and uh, paradoxes, hypocrisies in our behavior that are a lot more complex than how we might rationalize our behavior. Um, so that and the this is again what Middlemarch is all about, is these are conflicting motives, the perverse ways in which our intentions play out in the real world. The Romantic period was a time of disruption and revolution and instability. Indeed, the Romantics never thought of themselves as romantic. They didn't think of themselves as living in the Romantic period. I think they thought of themselves as living in a revolutionary period and a period of war. Um, but the term is interesting because it was applied to the period retrospectively by the Victorians, by people of George Eliot's era, in a kind of derogatory sense. Sort of the term romantic retains still, suggesting sort of soft-mindedness, impractical, fantastical, um, idle imagination. Um, and what's interesting, I think these terms are true. The Victorian period, by contrast to the Romantic period, is more stable, more uh, prosperous, and a period of stabilizing the kind of government, welfare state, broad democracy, and consumer capitalism uh, that would become the norm for us. So the um, denigration of Romanticism is um, there's a sense of uh, denigrating the revolutionary aspirations, the political aspirations of the Romantics as impractical. Um, they just needed to settle down and accept, kind of the bourgeois fate that was normalized in the Victorian period. Um, uh, a sort of social consensus took place that George Eliot now, by returning to the Romantic period, is kind of, you know, excavating a, a broader set of possibilities, maybe, than the Victorian period itself recognizes in the present. Um, and I think another interesting aspect of this is that not only did Romanticism doesn't just suggest kind of revolutionary, fantastical aspirations, but in a sense, it really defines basic values. I think we all share, assume, um, freedom, self determination, love. Um, it's a little sad, I think, that we denigrate the a term that means the devotion to um, things like freedom and love. And there, isn't doesn't individualism entail kind of commitment, pursuit of self-determining life? That's kind of an echo of heroism, even if you wouldn't want to go that far. The 18th century Swiss philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau was big inspiration for the French Revolution, um, and the Romantic movement in general, because he was the first to identify um, very compellingly a disconnect between the way in which we think about freedom and equality and what these terms really mean in practice. It's reason which turns man's mind back upon itself and divides him from everything that could disturb and afflict him. It's philosophy that isolates him, bids him to say at the sight of misfortunes of others, perish if you will, I am secure. So, this is what the poet William Blake called mind forged manacles. Um, our ideas kind of talk us out of our felt intuitive social bonds, our maybe intuitive desires, um, and do it in a very insidious way. We thinking recreates the world in a new way, and a very rigid, and Rousseau points out, even kind of tyrannical way. This tyranny is a great theme of William Blake's. He explores in a lot of his most famous songs, from the Songs of Innocence and Experience, like The Tiger, The Little Black Boy, The Chimney Sweeper, are all about this, the way in which society teaches us to be cruel, the human abstract. Um, the Fly is about how a kind of slippery slope of just nihilistic, violent tyranny, um, insidious attitude of indifference toward life. Um, that I think we're all familiar with on some level. It's really compelling. It's just talking about idly swatting a fly, um, and it has this sort of insidious, um, entails this nihilistic disregard of life, dispensability of life, or Blake here suggests, is rooted in the Cartesian attitude. I think, therefore I am. It's kind of ironized in the song when he says, if thought is life and strength and breath, and want of thought is death. So, thought, he's exploring the correlation of living with thinking is a pervasive, just civilizational attitude. It's hard to escape, to sort of identify yourself with the self that thinks, and just sort of disregard of what we perceive as the unthinking material world. But what Blake shows here is that it comes back to haunt you, that you can, that again, there's a slippery slope. You can swat the fly and think nothing of it. But it applies to your body too. I think that suggested really directly right at the beginning, the way he characterizes the idle action itself of swatting the fly. It's an act of the thoughtless hand. So if the self is correlated with thinking, then the body is alien. It's like you're looking at your own hand as a kind of zombie alien. And indeed, he said that's how the poem concludes. It's I am a happy fly if I live or if I die. The great song, The Human Abstract, it probes the hypocrisies of conventional morality. What I was talking about is like Victorian bourgeois morality, that espouses compassion and pity and mercy. On the one hand, he's speaking up for more authentic kind of compassion. He's speaking up for compassion, but he's bringing to bear a very acute intelligence. He's criticizing here is soft-mindedness itself, complacency. And so he's making a very sharp insight here, which is that if you make pity your prime virtue, then you kind of need people to be suffering, because otherwise you can't feel sorry for them. You need people to feel sorry for. Pity would be no more if we did not make somebody poor, and mercy no more could be if all were as happy as we. So even our, ideas of compassion, our positive ideas of virtue, conceal this kind of tyranny, cruelty, and Blake calls mind forged manacles, or in this picture depicts as a net, a trap growing out of this man's head. Rousseau notices that domination does not exist in nature. Tyranny does not exist in nature. We, from the position of civilization, tend to look at nature as savage. So Rousseau's famous for the opposite image of the kind of happy savage, the noble savage. That image itself might seem dubious, dubiously, romanticizing, simplistically romanticizing unspoiled nature. But Rousseau's argument, in fact, is very compelling and sophisticated. Nature, the point about Rousseau's point about nature is not that it's peaceful, but on the contrary, but that it's so competitive that creatures have no reason for domination. That's a waste of time. It's a waste of energy to dominate others. You take what you need and move on in nature because natural selection, survival of the fittest is so exacting. It's pretty interesting if you think, you think when, especially when you think about how crazily unequal the inequality, all the suffering that results from inequality in human society. Um, so I hear it constantly repeated that in a natural state, the strong would oppress the weak. But what is here meant by oppression? Some, it said, would violently domineer over others, who would groan under servile submission to their caprices. This is what I see in among us in civilization, but I don't know how it could be inferred of a man in the state of nature who could not easily be brought to conceive what we mean by dominion and servitude. One man, it's true, might seize the fruits which another had gathered, the game he had killed, or the cave he had chosen for shelter. If there's going to be, theft. But how would he ever be able to exact obedience? What ties of dependence could there be among men without possessions? I think that's a very, very compelling argument. The uh, representation of the world in terms of law, logic, and reason, um, including property, creates what Rousseau called a second nature, recreates the world in these logical and abstract, timeless terms, creates a reality that didn't formerly exist. Creates this possibility of tyranny because it creates an idea of ownership, an idea of ego, of selfhood, an abiding concern for me and what's mine. It just didn't exist before, Rousseau suggests. In nature, what use do I have for these abstract concepts? I'm just dealing day to day with the circumstance at hand. So Rousseau writes, the first man who, having enclosed a piece of ground, bethought himself of saying, "This is mine," and found people simple enough to believe him, was the real founder of civil society. From how many crimes, wars, and murders, from how many horrors and misfortunes might not anyone have saved mankind by pulling up the stakes or filling up the ditch, crying to his fellows, "Beware of listening to this impostor. You are undone if you once forget that the fruits of the earth belong to us all, and the earth itself to nobody." That kind of sums up a lot of romantic writing right there. I mean, it's a voice from another world, this beware. You've been, it's, the world has been distorted. You've been sold a lie. And this appeal to wake up to um, a less, a less violent world. So that's kind of a experiment that Mary Shelley um, constructs in the novel Frankenstein. She has the creature wake up twice, sort of once in civilization and once in nature.